come to be, man?
This word monster come to mind. 1 minute you're a person like you are, the next minute you're not.
I know you're tired of this monster.
You want to see him? Twice in hand, round.
Did the monster seek them out?
Yes and no. 1 minute I'm fine, the next minute I'm honey-wiped.
It has happened again, still again. A woman has been found murdered in one of the most painful forms of murder.
Detectives say they found the nude body of a 43-year-old woman. The victim has been identified as Donna Bennett Johnston of Baton Rouge. The cause of death? Strangulation.
Sean Gillis is Baton Rouge's latest suspected serial killer. The most recent homicide, 43-year-old Donna Bennett Johnston.
How did you encounter Donna?
I encountered Donna on my first, shall we say, really successful hunt, capture, and kill. I left with the intent to find a woman and do her mortal harm. When I had the urge, it was all. Something in me had to be satiated. It was early Thursday morning. I encountered her near Geronimo Street. I picked her up. We began talking. I noticed she was very drunk. We went off in search of a secluded area where the deed could be done. And by the deed, I mean killing her. Now, she was still ostensibly thinking we were going off to have sex.
It's interesting that Gillis had a live-in partner and fulfilled the role of step-parent. We do see this sometimes with individuals who are psychopathic. They live a public life that appears on paper to look like everybody else. Gillis wants to blend in, which is part of how I think he lured his victims in.
She just fell asleep. I mean, we're talking sleep, deep sleep. For a minute, I was thinking, maybe this is going to be a lot easier than I thought. I didn't even need to stealthily get the tie wrap. I just casually picked it up, stuck it on her head, pulled her head forward, dropped it on her, still didn't wake up. Then, she woke up. She's, I can't breathe. And, I just told her that's the plan,
She's not even really able to fight back. I think that's where you see a streak of sadism in him, that even in this very focused kill that was quick by his own description, he still needed that moment for her to plead, to beg. I think that it was a necessary first step to start the process of the arousal for him.
At this point, I wanted some pictures. Popped open the trunk. We got a few good pictures. It was just many poses, her legs hanging out the trunk, her top torso hanging out the trunk, both, with her body curved into the trunk. Artistic say removed her completely from the trunk and laid her face down, trying to react to other forensic scenes I'd seen, as if I were a crime scene photographer. Click, click, rolled her over, positioned her in another way. Click, click.
What was that fascination about?
You could do things with a dead woman you couldn't even dream of doing with a live woman. It's yours to do with as you wished. I had the machete. I wanted to get a hold on. I got the hand. And it was pretty much time to get out of here.
His willingness to act this out and make his arms go limp and demonstrate what a dead body might look like hanging out of a trunk. It just moves, the theatrical dimension of his behavior forward. And also gives you some clue as to the kind of fantasies that he has. Have complete control over the body as if it were a doll or an object. is apparently amusing to him.
The photography allowed him to have a token to take with him to relive the crime. And the purpose of reliving the crime when someone is a sexual sadist is to recreate that arousal sexually for themselves. Those days when he felt bored or flat or disengaged, which is very common for psychopaths, those photographs fill that void.
When we see a crime scene, we look at it, we'll say, what's the degree of fantasy here?
And where was I between Hitchcock and Disney?
Tell me, what's your mom like?
Wonderful. She was married when she had me. Dad left town about a year or two after I was born. And so she had to both be the nurturer and the disciplinarian. We're Roman Catholics.
As I am.
Okay, then you understand the guilt. Sex was dirty. One time, this is cute. I did touch my mother's breast when I was starting 9, 10, 11, 12 in that area. You know, I just, for the fun of it, just, you know, but even when I was littler, I knew what I was doing. I mean, I could nuzzle her. Her friends had come over and they're, oh, how cute. Look at him, he's so cute. And I'm just rubbing my face in there. Yeah, if you only knew.
Did you ever think about having sex with her?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm sorry, any boy that tells you they didn't is lying to you.
He was suggesting to the profiler that this is every boy's fantasy. Now, is it really? You know, I think he is mistaken, but it lets you know from an early age that there was something wrong with him.
When you're dealing with someone who's this psychopathic, you have to take a lot of what they're saying with a grain of salt. Because a very cliche, stereotypical belief a lot of criminals have is that psychologists have this anchored belief that boys want to have sex with their moms. So this is really him playing to the profiler. He wants to be studied. Okay, come study me. I'm such an interesting, complex person. So he's giving her what he thinks she wants to hear.
If she were to pass away, it would have been a while before I would have called the authorities to let them know there was a dead body in the house.
What would you have done with her?
She would have been a life-size Barbie doll. There would have been a lot of playing.
Like what?
Posing, changing the clothes, putting her in something sexy, role-playing, I guess, like you would do with a doll.
He compared her to a Barbie doll, something lifeless, nonetheless arousing for him. The average person would find this grotesque. He likes it better if they're dead, because therefore there's no conversation, there's no being challenged on his motives or his desires, and therefore he can revel in his perverse fantasies.
This gives us a window into where Gillis's fantasies may have begun. He had to plot and correct and reform and restage the fantasy in his mind before he actually went out and started hunting real live women.
Tell me an approximate number. 4, 5, 6, 7.
Honestly, there so easily could have been so many more. When my utter contempt for society in general began, it became a slow desire to annihilate. They weren't human. I'd seen Hardy dozens of times, jogging down Perkins Road and stuff. I guess you could call it stalking after a while. I mean, she was cute. Certainly on that day, I knew she was coming by. There was just something about the bounce of her hair or something. I was in that zone then.
So there's that hunting behavior, getting to know his specimen, his kill. Being in the zone is really that high. Once he gets locked and loaded on the idea that he's going to go kill again and torture, he's ready to go do it. I turned and then just gunned it. I swiped her and she flipped over in the ditch. I mean, it wasn't like, my God, I hit a woman, I'm coming to check on her.
It's like, my God, I've started it, I've got to finish it. As she was getting up, I was out the car and on top of her.
You already had the object in your hand you was going to use to kill it.
That was a large nylon tie wrap device. You got like maybe 30 seconds to 45 seconds before you just gone. Obviously, there was some sick pleasure in my brain, but I derived no pleasure.
Well, then, who took the pleasure? What is he blaming, his brain and not himself? So that's where you see he's being disingenuous. It comes across as baloney.
He's splitting off parts of himself. There's the monster, there's the brain, and these things are different than Gillis. That's what he's essentially saying to us. It's not true. We understand it's all part and parcel of himself as one collective person who's doing these acts. But I think there's a part of him that does struggle to understand his own fantasies.
I checked her out, touched her. I was going to have sex with her, but I couldn't. Miss Schmidt, I did bring into the house. I sat her up on one of the wooden chairs with her arms behind it, and she was just sitting there.
Did you cut her in any way?
I had marked her to make cuts with a red Sharpie, like a butcher would mark a cut of meat. But I'm just sitting there looking at her. I said, no, she's just too pretty to do this to.
It's important to note that he incapacitated her by running her over with his car. There was no fighting for her life. There was no begging. There was no pleading. And a sadist needs that arousal, creating fear in someone. And so maybe he is learning something about what turns him on and what turns him off.
I'm interested in your age at your first violent fantasy.
Age-wise, I'm thinking between 9, 10, and 12.
Okay, tell me about that.
I had a really gorgeous cousin. I wondered what it would be like to fondle her deceased body, to the point that I tried to make that happen. I actually pushed her off a wall, and she busted her head open. Didn't die, thankfully, but had she, while waiting for the paramedics, I probably would have copped my first feel of a corpse.
Whether it happened or not is almost irrelevant. Gillis is giving us a window into how clear his sexual fantasies were and how far back they go. And there is a component of the need for them to be dead and unresponsive.
These things are not about relationships. These things are about objectification and power, because he wants them dead. It's a really twisted way of pursuing your sexual interests, making death a precursor. To be this murderous and perverse, you have to have a well of despair and emptiness.
So these are isolated individuals, all of them when you encounter them?
Basically, yeah. I mean, Johnny May's the only one that I had extended dealings with. I genuinely liked her, and the feeling was mutual.
How did you happen upon her?
I was looking for her.
You were?
Yeah. She was intoxicated, and I picked Johnny up. We were driving around, talking a little, and she just leaned over and fell asleep in my lap. I pulled behind some closed bar. I was listening to music, stroking her hair. Then all of a sudden, I just grabbed the nylon tie wrap, picked her head up, pulled it, and that was it. And then pulled her out the car. And I laid her down and stripped her nude.
What prompted you to kill her?
The woman was salt to the earth. To this day, I don't know why. This was a woman I could have, like a wife, gotten anything from. I had nothing against her. She never did me wrong.
This is victim number 7. He likely is also experiencing a greater need for intensity, for that thrill and that high, which means it takes more and more to get the same rise. And maybe killing somebody close to him gave him that arousal that he wanted.
I mean, I was willing to kill someone I knew because I had this kind of itch that is frightening. You kind of get a feel for how disturbed he really is.
What happened to Johnny's hands?
Trust me, I don't know. I've never had a hand fetish. I'm more of a leg and man, personally. I also painted the fingernails. That was just something that I did with Johnny May. All the faces haunt me, but hers haunts me the most. I mean, I kissed her and closed her eyes, and she died.
He's reflecting a kind of tender attitude, and the fact that he would paint her fingernails, essentially prettier her up, does suggest something a little bit fetishistic. It's a very peculiar behavior, and it harkens back to his mother, dressing her up like a Barbie doll.
For Gillis, human beings aren't whole entities. They're a compilation of parts, sort of how we talked about his brain being different than him. I find myself wondering whether those hands are reminiscent of some earlier experiences that he had had.
What was your dad like?
I mean, he was a total screw-up, a total I was like 1 or 2 when he split, so I didn't know Daddy much. I didn't know him until I was 16. The second time we met, that thing had a flat here and there. I had to go pick up the thing. There were, name it, all sort of sexual paraphernalia, ripped chains up, as well as pictures of my dad. Men, girls, just a massive orgy. And I had 2 friends with me, too, who was like, so that's what sort of fella you are, huh? You know, God, I wanted to kill him beyond it. That was the dirtiest, dirty. Everyone knew. Everyone knew.
What did they know?
They knew I was his son. Genes passed down. Again, that made me scary. Am I going to grow up to do that? I know I grow up to do something worse.
This display of emotion is synthetic. It doesn't appear to be sincere or real, and I think it's a load of crap. You have a situation with a father who is estranged from his son. They have no relationship at all. So I find it hard to believe that he would have sent his son over to the house to pick up some things, and he just leaves all of these things about his personal sex life out and about. Gillis's references to the whips and the chains and orgies and things of that nature, I think really just gives us a window into how his leap into pornography addiction may have gone. It may have started with interests in sadomasochism and became increasingly more dark.
Sean, did your dad try to sexually assault you?
I don't know. After that moment, everything, every touch on the back, every, good voice out his
I also understand that wanting to remove the hands is, in effect, removing the hands is extremely significant.
His actions of my father's hands and mine. The deeds they do. The deeds I do with them.
I think the hands makes for a good story. It's too convenient. It fits together too cleanly. His father left when he was 1 or 2 years old, and so he's just adopting this new story right before our very eyes in this interview. I don't find it credible. So I really take this as superficial attempts to look like he cares, like he has a sense of emotion or empathy, when in fact he doesn't.
He is feeling bad for himself, feeling like he's nothing. And he levels the playing field by murdering and dismembering people. He can go from feeling bad about himself and terrible to feeling grandiose and powerful. It's a high and a low, and the end result is self-loathing. This is true of all, serial murderers. It's like a cycle. So he is definitely a psychopath and a frightening person, and if not caught, predictably would continue to do what he did.
I'm at heart not a violent person.
But I would do it again. You know that.
Live by the sword, die by the sword. When I'm gone, please believe. You're home.
Are you insane?
No, I'm not. However, the actions I adopted may look insane towards society. But basically what I do is an ancient rite of getting rid of scum. I'm standing over him with the axe. Swung again. That's ancient justice.
Deafening music coming from this Joppa townhouse on the same day that a boarder renting a room inside, 37-year-old Cujo Agiacodi, was last seen alive.
I heard loud music, like really loud, and that's unusual.
Police flooded the neighborhood, searching for evidence that Cody had been murdered.
Tell me what happened.
Last night, I went down to the basement and I opened the laundry door. And I saw 2 pans for baking. And then I saw 3 different objects. And they looked like hands and a head. I asked Alex, come down here. I asked him, what is it? And he said, don't worry about it. It's none of your business.
When you see these remains inside the pan, do you think that maybe they're,
Cujo?
Mm-hmm.
That was my first thought.
You know, Cujo's been missing 4 days. That's right. You know, we're pretty concerned about him, obviously. I'm worried about him, too. If you were us, where would you look for Cujo? Cujo, big girl. Probably have to stay.
Out of state. Why did he choose out of state? He's play acting. He's playing the card of, you know, I don't know what you want from me. Misdirection can sometimes be useful, but it comes across as lame in a way.
He's not particularly believable. He's detached. His facial expression and voice are not appropriate for what's happened. And that's also true of his body. He's stiff, he's cold, and he's numb.
I just want to talk to you tonight about what your brother saw. Last week, I collected a jackal or a fox. It was like roadkill. Usually, I trap animals, so I figured let me gut it up. What do you do with the meat? I brought it in. It was nasty. Why would your brother think they were human? He said that he saw something that was blackened and like he couldn't really describe it, and he said he wasn't sure. And he mentioned it to my father and mother. Okay. Nothing about no human skull. Were they parts of Cujo? No.
His story isn't plausible. It just can't believe for a minute that the brother would come down the stairs and mistake a human skull and hands in baking trays for roadkill.
The officer did ask him about skulls, so he chose to interject the notion of a skull. And there's your tip.
Cujo is dead. That's a fact. So the question is, why? You can tell the difference between the blood of a fox and the blood of a human being.
Yes.
What do you think the blood under your mattress showed?
That's the blood from period.
From period?
Yeah, a woman's period.
And what woman would that be?
Oh, she doesn't stay anymore.
And what about the blood that was in
the box? Blood box. That's a fox blood there.
That was human blood. Tell me, Alex, tell me what you did. How did you kill him?
Cujo staying in the basement. Nobody wants to go into the basement. And I stay in the basement with him. So I asked him, is he ready to die? He was like, no, he's not ready to die. So, too bad he went in and to death.
You waited for him to fall asleep?
Oh, yeah.
How was he sleeping?
In a funeral rest position. When I came downstairs, I was standing over him with the axe. I swung again.
Where did you strike him with the axe?
His jaw. The blood came gushing from his body. His body didn't move. After that, I chopped him off. They said a prayer for him.
Why do you say a prayer for him? One suspects that, references to angels of death and saying prayers, that somewhere in his head is this kind of religious delusion. This is highly ritualized, and it reflects a lot of very discombobulated thinking and perverse thinking.
In order for you to commit such a violent crime, and then to continue with it, you have to completely dehumanize the victim. The callousness, that's the core of psychopathy.
We're looking at someone who I think has a thought disorder, that has a psychotic disorder. He is inert, and he's sitting there, and in response to the question, he's simply recalling events. It's as if he's just reciting the sequence.
After that, I let him bleed out. And I got him a knife, cut him up, and took his heart out.
What did you use to cut his heart out?
I used my hands.
I'm sure from his perspective, the heart is symbolic of something. It's kind of in a perverse way, like a mythological power move, and sort of like from a warrior's perspective, which is what I think he likens himself to on some level. You're robbing your victim of his essence. It's certainly not anything that people believe in contemporary societies. I don't know why these rituals would be important to him, but that's typically, anthropologically and historically, what these things signify.
You were responsible for what happened to Cujo, but this was an opportunity for you to say why this thing happened.
I want to say that.
Is this what I'm left with? Even his family? Yeah, he killed Cujo, but he wasn't going to tell me because he wanted to get a cigarette. That's terrible, Alex.
Life is terrible.
Did you take his life?
I mean, he's not in existence.
Where did Cujo wind up?
It's right under your nose.
Not at the police station, I hope.
No.
Okay, where?
Well, one is in my stomach.
What part was that?
It's hard.
I believe there is a religious aspect to him consuming Cujo's heart. In the history of cannibalism, in these religious practices where people were consumed, it was really important to assimilate the life, the soul, the energy from the other person. But what we're seeing here is a contemporary manifestation of it in a person who's delusional.
Criminal cannibalism is extremely rare. One of the biggest taboos in modern life is the consumption of human flesh. And this is pathological, meaning it's linked to something that's not part of a ritual, that's not part of a system, that's not part of a society.
He laughs when he's talking about it. It's grotesque in a way that leads one to thinking that he really is psychotic.
Are there pieces of Cujo in or around your house? Can you give me an idea where they are?
Well, his head is taken care of.
Can you tell me any more than that?
Do you have anybody at the house right now?
Mm-hmm.
Can you get him on the phone?
I'm gonna put you on speakerphone, okay?
All right. Go ahead, Alex.
Okay, go to the dining room. Do you see a bag of charcoal?
Your brother mentioned seeing the head. He also thought he saw some hands.
Everything's in there.
Everything's in the one charcoal bag. Okay.
That's what he put.
Kinua is amused and smug, and there are two explanations for this. It's actually very common for schizophrenics to laugh heartily while describing something not at all funny. And part of it, of course, could be attributed to the callousness that you see in psychopathy. So perhaps it's a blend of both.
He's not disturbed by the killing. That's the psychopathic element. The driving force for that may be delusional. In his mind, it all makes sense. They're still shocked by it, as we are when we learn about what he did. But in his mind, that's what was necessary to do.
Nobody is safe, no matter where you are. It could be even in your own room. It could be even in your own school. It could be in anywhere. It could be in your office. It could be in your home. It could be anywhere.
The guy's paranoid. And that's the message that he's broadcasting, is that no one is really safe. So that must mean he thinks things can happen to him too.
This is a social media post that Alex Kinua posted about 6 months before he committed the crime. Never forget the Virginia Tech massacre, students. Take note of a problem, solve that. Event for spring 2012 coming up. Prevent another university shooting. He would view us as the problem, that we who don't take action are the problem. He is the solution.
He was in Maryland, and that's right next door to Virginia. So I think, there's certainly a proximity, maybe a fear, but if you're paranoid, that proximity gets closer than it really is. You get a sense of Mr. Kinua's life that there was always some kind of threat lurking. Mr. Kinua was diagnosed formally as paranoid schizophrenic. It's important to note that most paranoid schizophrenics are not remotely violent. But paranoid schizophrenia with psychopathic features and violence are an extremely dangerous combination.
Alex, what threat did you perceive from Cujo? Why did you do what you did?
The whole family demeanor has changed. Why Cujo's staying in the basement. His ulterior motive was to sacrifice my family. I saw it real clearly. And I was like, not another night in our house. I pick up on instinctual person. I'm overprotected. His hands get touched. Just the thought of him touching any of my brothers, or my sister, or my parents, cousins, or his head.
Let's not forget that he's already dead. It's really not consistent with anything that we typically think of in Western culture. After, someone has died, that parts of their body pose a threat.
It can seem pretty demented if you're a normal person. If you happen to be paranoid, it absolutely makes sense. He's seeing plots and evil intent in things that you or I might look at and say, wait a minute, they're not necessarily connected.
This is part of, the delusional worsening, that the family's under threat, they're being annihilated by an outsider. As the delusions get deeper, so does the psychopathic process.
Nobody has been messing with my brothers and sisters because I've been here. Because when they came here, they were younger. We were like prey.
You were the protector now.
Oh, I'm like the predator.
This is your trophy to yourself. Am I wrong?
Trophy, I wouldn't say trophy, more so like collector's item.
He seems proud of what he did. There's like a feather in his cap that he could wield this much power.
This has a much deeper meaning, perhaps something of a religious significance. His comment that it's not a trophy, but that he's a collector, it's intriguing. We certainly have seen in different serial killers that people collect a memento. They collect an object. He's taking body parts, right? Whereas other people keep a necklace, a bracelet, or something else. They don't perhaps engage in cannibalism. Like many people who have a delusion, once they've decided to tell you about it, they're usually very straightforward about what their thinking is, because in their mind, they're not crazy. From Kimya's perspective, he is defending his family from someone who has a plot to harm them all, or who is molesting them, and who is going to kill his family in some way.
Did you put him in anything?
Wrapped him up in a bag.
And took him where?
To the church.
Was there any particular reason that you did that?
That's symbolic. Mom cooked his head and his hands.
And then what did you do with him after that?
Prepare to eat him.
There is a ritualistic component to what he's describing. So he would fall into our category of a visionary psychopath. He's completing a mission that he believes in, and this gives him permission to do all these things and feel no remorse.
Bringing this dismembered body to a church ties into his delusional system, this kind of religious idea.
How do you feel now?
Justice is served. That's all of it.
What do you think should happen to you for this?
Put me insane now. No.
Are you insane?
No, I'm not. However, the action the doctor may look insane towards society, but
Basically what I do is an ancient rite of getting rid of skull. And that's the way you look at Cujo. It's ancient justice.
Ancient justice. This can feel pretty cold to the rest of us. This view of the other person as a non-person and not having feelings or remorse is a sign of being a psychopath.
It's funny to me that he says, I'm not insane. But the truth is, there's no really good reason for this crime to have been committed other than paranoia.
21-year-old Alexander Kanyua, who was indicted in June on first-degree murder, has been undergoing a competency evaluation at a maximum security psychiatric hospital in Jessup. The court recently received a report from the hospital stating the Joppatown man should be found incompetent to stand trial without a hearing.
Hospitals are built on a simple promise. Behind every set of automatic doors, every brightly lit corridor, and every intensive care unit, there exists an unspoken agreement between strangers. Patients surrender control of their lives to people they have never met, trusting that doctors, nurses, and therapists will make every possible effort to keep them alive. Families wait through sleepless nights believing that every alarm, every hurried footstep, and every whispered consultation is part of a relentless fight against illness. It is a place where fear is expected, where grief is sometimes unavoidable, but where the intent to heal is never supposed to be questioned. That assumption is what allows modern medicine to function. Without trust, even the most advanced hospital becomes little more than a building filled with machines. In the late 1980s and throughout much of the 1990s, Glendale Adventist Medical Center in Glendale, California, appeared no different from countless other American hospitals. Patients suffering from severe respiratory illnesses, heart failure, advanced cancers, and multiple organ failure arrived seeking treatment. Many were elderly. Many were critically ill. Some would recover. Others, despite every medical intervention available, would not survive. Death was an unfortunate but familiar reality within the intensive care units, where physicians and respiratory therapists worked around the clock to support patients whose lungs could no longer sustain life on their own. Among those healthcare professionals was a young respiratory therapist named Efren Saldivar. Born on September 30th, 1969, in Brownsville, Texas, Saldivar came from a family of Mexican heritage and grew up in modest circumstances. Nothing publicly known about his early years suggested the trajectory his life would eventually take. Friends and acquaintances later described him as quiet, reserved, and generally unremarkable. He had no documented history of violence, no criminal record, and no reputation for aggression. Unlike many notorious serial offenders whose childhoods are often marked by documented abuse, escalating violence, or repeated criminal behavior, there is no evidence in the available record that Saldivar displayed such warning signs. If someone had encountered him before he entered the medical profession, there would have been little reason to predict that his name would one day become associated with one of the most disturbing hospital homicide investigations in American history. After completing high school, Saldivar pursued training in respiratory therapy, a specialized branch of healthcare dedicated to patients experiencing breathing disorders or respiratory failure. Respiratory therapists occupy a unique role inside hospitals. While physicians diagnose illnesses and nurses coordinate much of a patient's direct care, respiratory therapists focus specifically on the lungs and airway. Their responsibilities include monitoring oxygen levels, managing ventilators, assisting with endotracheal intubation, maintaining artificial airways, suctioning secretions from patients unable to clear them independently, and working closely with intensive care physicians whenever a patient's breathing begins to fail. In many hospitals, respiratory therapists move continuously between departments, responding wherever critically ill patients require immediate intervention. They become familiar faces in emergency departments, operating rooms, intensive care units, and post-surgical recovery wards. Because respiratory emergencies can develop within seconds, these specialists are granted rapid access to vulnerable patients, sophisticated life support equipment, and medications used in airway management. It is a position built on expertise, speed, and trust. Upon completing his training around 1988, Saldivar was hired by Glendale Adventist Medical Center. For a young healthcare worker, the opportunity represented professional stability and responsibility. The hospital served a large community, treating patients with a wide range of medical conditions. Every shift presented new emergencies and difficult clinical decisions. Respiratory therapists like Saldivar frequently found themselves caring for patients whose conditions could change dramatically within moments. Some required mechanical ventilation. Others depended on constant monitoring to survive the night. Many patients entering intensive care were already confronting life-threatening illnesses long before Saldivar ever stepped into their rooms. Their families understood that survival was uncertain. Doctors understood it. Nurses understood it. Within such an environment, death itself was never considered extraordinary. This reality would later become one of the greatest obstacles investigators faced. Saldivar reportedly worked primarily during night shifts. Hospitals after dark operate differently from their daytime routines. Staffing levels are generally lower. Administrative personnel have gone home. Specialists may remain on call rather than physically present within the building. Nurses often care for multiple critically ill patients simultaneously, balancing medication schedules, emergency responses, physician orders, and family concerns under considerable pressure. Respiratory therapists continue moving from room to room whenever ventilators require adjustment or patients begin struggling to breathe. Although professional standards remain unchanged, fewer supervisors are physically present during overnight hours. Critical decisions still occur, but they often unfold with less direct oversight than during busy daytime operations. Night shifts demand independence and efficiency from experienced healthcare workers. For someone intent on violating that trust, those same conditions could also reduce opportunities for immediate detection. None of this meant wrongdoing was inevitable. Thousands of healthcare professionals have devoted entire careers to overnight hospital work with extraordinary compassion and integrity. Nevertheless, investigators would later conclude that Saldivar's schedule provided him access to critically ill patients at times when routine supervision was naturally reduced. At the time, however, nothing about his work schedule distinguished him from countless other employees committed to caring for patients through the longest hours of the night. His responsibilities placed him in close contact with some of the hospital's sickest individuals. Respiratory therapists often respond during moments when patients are already deteriorating. Someone experiencing respiratory distress may suddenly require oxygen adjustments, ventilator changes, airway suctioning, or emergency intervention. Consequently, if a patient died shortly after a respiratory therapist entered the room, the timing alone would not necessarily appear suspicious. The therapist had been summoned precisely because the patient's condition had become unstable. This context is essential to understanding why concerns, even when they eventually emerged, proved so difficult to transform into evidence. Throughout the early years of Saldivar's employment, colleagues largely viewed him as another member of the hospital staff carrying out demanding responsibilities. He possessed the technical qualifications expected of someone in his position. He moved among intensive care units and other hospital departments, treating patients with severe respiratory illnesses alongside physicians and nurses whose shared objective was preserving life whenever possible. Families encountering him likely saw only another healthcare professional contributing to the complex network of care surrounding their loved ones. Few people pay close attention to respiratory therapists unless an emergency arises. Their work often occurs quietly in the background, adjusting machines, checking oxygen levels, and ensuring patients continue breathing through the night. It is a profession defined more by competence than visibility. That anonymity, investigators would later argue, became one of Saldivar's greatest advantages. Years after his employment began, authorities would accuse him of exploiting precisely the responsibilities entrusted to him. According to the criminal investigation, his access to ventilators, medications, and critically ill patients created opportunities that would ultimately lead to multiple murders. Yet it is important to distinguish hindsight from contemporary perception. During these early years, no criminal charges existed. No confession had been made. No forensic evidence had yet been uncovered. The hospital continued operating as it always had, treating patients whose illnesses often carried grim prognoses regardless of medical intervention. Every death could be explained by disease. Every emergency fit the expectations of intensive care medicine. It was within this environment that the first seeds of suspicion, still invisible to almost everyone around him, quietly took root. The man walking the hospital corridors during those overnight shifts appeared to be fulfilling the same mission as every other healthcare professional around him, helping patients breathe long enough to see another day. Only much later would investigators begin asking whether, behind the appearance of ordinary medical care, those same hospital corridors had concealed something far more disturbing. At Glendale Adventist Medical Center, the intensive care units never truly slept. Long after visiting hours had ended and the public entrances had grown quiet, the most critically ill patients remained surrounded by the steady rhythm of machines that measured every heartbeat and every breath. Mechanical ventilators pushed air into damaged lungs. Infusion pumps delivered carefully calculated medications through intravenous lines. Cardiac monitors displayed constantly shifting numbers that physicians and nurses interpreted as signs of either recovery or decline. Families who stayed through the night learned to recognize the sounds without fully understanding their meaning. Every alarm carried the possibility of hope or tragedy. Every member of the medical staff moved with a sense of urgency, knowing that even a few seconds could determine whether a patient survived another hour. It was an environment where death was never unexpected, but it was always treated as something to be delayed for as long as medicine allowed. Many of the patients admitted to these units were already confronting illnesses from which there was little chance of recovery. Some were elderly individuals whose bodies had gradually weakened after years of chronic disease. Others suffered from advanced cancers that no longer responded to treatment. Heart failure, severe pneumonia, respiratory collapse, and multiple organ failure were familiar diagnoses within the hospital. Physicians frequently explained to families that despite every available intervention, some patients might not survive. These conversations were among the most difficult responsibilities in medicine because they forced loved ones to prepare for outcomes they desperately hoped would never come. In this setting, the death of a patient, while heartbreaking, was not automatically viewed as suspicious. Hospitals caring for critically ill individuals inevitably experience loss. Every member of the healthcare team understood this reality. Respiratory therapists occupied an especially important position during these final stages of illness. Whenever a patient struggled to breathe, nurses often called for respiratory therapy assistance. These specialists adjusted ventilators, evaluated oxygen delivery, suction-blocked airways, and worked alongside physicians during emergencies. Their arrival at a patient's bedside often coincided with moments of severe medical deterioration. Consequently, if a respiratory therapist entered a room shortly before a patient died, few people would consider that unusual. The therapist had been summoned because the patient's condition was already worsening. This ordinary sequence of events would later become one of the greatest barriers investigators encountered while attempting to separate natural deaths from criminal acts. During the early 1990s, however, Some members of the hospital staff gradually began noticing something that was difficult to explain. The observations were not dramatic at first. No single incident immediately stood apart from the countless medical emergencies occurring every week. Instead, concern developed slowly through repeated experiences that seemed, individually, capable of innocent explanation, but collectively became increasingly difficult to ignore. According to later accounts from hospital employees, certain nurses observed that patients often died unusually soon after Efren Saldivar became involved in their care. The pattern was subtle enough that no one could identify exactly when they first recognized it. One patient would experience an unexpected respiratory arrest shortly after Saldivar entered the room. Another would suffer cardiac arrest within minutes of receiving respiratory treatment. Yet another patient, despite appearing relatively stable only a short time earlier, would suddenly deteriorate beyond recovery. Each event could be explained by the severity of the patient's illness. Critically ill people sometimes decline with astonishing speed. Doctors and nurses witness such changes throughout their careers. Nevertheless, some staff members began privately discussing how often these sudden declines appeared to occur during Saldivar's shifts. The conversations remained informal. They took place between co-workers after difficult nights, during shift changes, or while reviewing the events surrounding another patient's death. At first, these discussions reflected uncertainty rather than accusation. Healthcare professionals are trained to question clinical outcomes, searching for lessons that might improve future patient care. It was therefore natural for employees to revisit unexpected deaths, asking whether warning signs had been overlooked or treatment decisions could have been different. But as similar conversations continued over time, one name reportedly surfaced more frequently than others: Efren Saldivar. According to witness accounts that later became part of the broader investigation, some employees eventually gave him an unofficial nickname, the Angel of Death. The phrase carried disturbing implications. Yet within the hospital, it remained little more than whispered speculation. It was not based upon documented evidence, forensic findings, or eyewitness testimony proving criminal conduct. Instead, it reflected growing unease among individuals who believed they were observing an unusual pattern without possessing the facts necessary to explain it. Another expression also emerged among staff members. Some reportedly referred to Saldivar's magic syringe, a dark joke suggesting that patients often died shortly after he provided care. Such remarks illustrated how suspicion had begun circulating within parts of the hospital. But they also demonstrated the limits of what anyone actually knew. Rumors are not evidence. Even repeated observations cannot establish criminal responsibility without objective proof. Hospital administrators faced a difficult reality. Critically ill patients die every day despite receiving appropriate medical treatment. Coincidence, confirmation bias, and the emotional weight of repeated losses can influence perceptions, particularly in environments where death is common. Accusing a healthcare professional of intentionally killing patients requires far more than suspicion. It requires evidence capable of surviving legal scrutiny. At that stage, no such evidence existed. No unauthorized medications had been identified. No toxicology reports suggested homicide. No patient had survived and directly accused Saldivar of wrongdoing. Every death remained medically explainable because each victim had been suffering from serious illnesses before their final decline. From an investigative perspective, the situation presented an almost impossible challenge. If a patient with advanced respiratory failure suddenly stopped breathing, physicians expected that possibility. If an elderly individual with multiple organ failure experienced cardiac arrest, the event fit the anticipated progression of disease. Every documented cause of death appeared consistent with the underlying medical conditions already present. Without physical evidence indicating outside intervention, distinguishing homicide from natural death became extraordinarily difficult. Meanwhile, Saldivar continued performing his duties as a respiratory therapist. He maintained access to intensive care units, ventilators, medications associated with respiratory treatment, and some of the hospital's sickest patients. Nothing publicly suggests that his daily responsibilities changed during this period. To families entering the hospital, he remained another healthcare professional wearing hospital identification and providing respiratory care. Parents, spouses, and children focused almost entirely on the condition of their loved ones rather than the identities of every staff member moving through the room. Trust remained the foundation of every interaction. Families believed that every person wearing hospital scrubs shared the same objective: preserving life whenever possible. Looking back, after the criminal investigation became public, many observers questioned why concerns had not resulted in immediate action. Such questions are understandable, but often overlook the realities confronting hospitals. Medicine depends upon evidence-based decision-making. Serious accusations cannot rest upon instinct alone. Staff members may experience uncomfortable feelings about a colleague. Yet administrators cannot remove healthcare workers from patient care solely because rumors circulate among employees. False accusations could destroy careers, damage reputations, and expose institutions to significant legal consequences. Without objective evidence, management faced limited options. The hospital environment itself further complicated recognition of any pattern. Hundreds of patients passed through the facility over the years. Numerous physicians directed treatment. Nurses rotated among shifts. Respiratory therapists responded to emergencies throughout different departments. Individual deaths rarely attracted prolonged attention because another critically ill patient always required immediate care. The relentless pace of hospital life often forces healthcare professionals to move quickly from one tragedy to the next. Grieving families deserve compassion, but the work of caring for other patients cannot stop. As a result, subtle patterns developing over months or years may remain hidden unless someone deliberately assembles information across many separate cases. During this period, no comprehensive review had yet connected the growing number of deaths occurring during Saldivar's shifts. Instead, isolated observations lingered in conversations among co-workers who sensed that something felt wrong but could not explain why. Their concerns remained fragments rather than conclusions. Every unexplained death blended into a larger landscape where mortality was already an expected part of intensive care medicine. Yet suspicion, once introduced, has a way of quietly changing how ordinary events are perceived. Each subsequent patient who died shortly after Saldivar's involvement reinforced the uneasy impressions already circulating among portions of the staff. Even so, impressions alone could neither prove guilt nor protect future patients. The unanswered questions remained buried beneath medical charts, death certificates, and assumptions that critically ill people sometimes die without warning. Unknown to almost everyone inside the hospital, those unanswered questions would eventually grow impossible to ignore. What had begun as whispered concerns and uneasy observations would soon attract attention beyond the hospital walls, setting in motion an investigation that would challenge not only one healthcare worker's actions, but also the very systems designed to detect wrongdoing within places devoted to healing. As concern quietly spread among a small number of hospital employees, investigators would eventually begin asking a question that lay at the center of the entire case. If patients had been intentionally killed, how could it have happened inside a modern American hospital without anyone immediately noticing? The answer, according to the evidence later presented in court, was not found in dramatic acts of violence or elaborate planning. Instead, it rested on an understanding of the hospital environment itself. Every day, critically ill patients received powerful medications, underwent invasive procedures, and depended on sophisticated machines simply to remain alive. Within intensive care units, healthcare professionals routinely handled drugs that could save lives when used appropriately, but become deadly if administered outside their intended purpose. Respiratory therapists, physicians, anesthesiologists, and nurses all worked within carefully coordinated systems built upon trust, communication, and adherence to medical protocols. According to prosecutors, Efren Saldivar exploited that trust in ways few people initially imagined possible. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation involved understanding the patients whom Saldivar allegedly targeted. The evidence presented during the criminal proceedings showed a consistent pattern rather than random selection. His victims were not healthy individuals recovering from minor illnesses. They were patients already facing severe medical conditions. Many were elderly. Some were unconscious or comatose. Others suffered from advanced cancers, heart failure, respiratory failure, or multiple organ dysfunction. Several required mechanical ventilation or intensive respiratory support simply to survive. These patients represented the most medically fragile population within the hospital. Their conditions were so serious that sudden deterioration often appeared medically plausible. From an investigative standpoint, this fact became critically important. If a healthy person unexpectedly dies, questions arise almost immediately. Autopsies become more likely, and unexplained findings often attract close scrutiny. But when someone is already critically ill, physicians may reasonably attribute death to the progression of disease unless evidence clearly indicates otherwise. Prosecutors argued that Saldivar understood this distinction. By selecting patients whose medical conditions already carried a high risk of death, he allegedly reduced the likelihood that anyone would suspect criminal intervention. The method investigators ultimately identified was equally disturbing because of its simplicity. According to court records and Saldivar's own statements during questioning, the primary drug involved was pancuronium bromide, commonly known by its brand name Pavulon. This medication serves legitimate medical purposes within hospitals. During certain surgical procedures or while assisting with airway management, physicians may administer pancuronium to relax skeletal muscles. Under carefully controlled circumstances, patients receiving the drug are simultaneously supported with anesthesia and mechanical ventilation because the medication paralyzes the muscles responsible for breathing. Used correctly by trained professionals, it is an important component of modern medical care. Used improperly, however, it becomes extraordinarily dangerous. Pancuronium does not directly stop the heart. Instead, it produces profound paralysis throughout the body, including the diaphragm and other muscles required for breathing. Without immediate ventilatory support, a person receiving a sufficient dose gradually loses the ability to breathe independently. Oxygen levels fall, carbon dioxide rises, and eventually cardiac arrest follows as the body can no longer sustain vital functions. The terrifying aspect of such paralysis is that, in the absence of appropriate anesthesia, an individual may remain conscious during the initial stages while being physically unable to move or call for help. Although the evidence in Saldivar's case does not establish the precise experiences of each victim, the pharmacological properties of the drug underscore why its unauthorized use represents such a profound betrayal of medical ethics. Investigators also learned that succinylcholine, another neuromuscular blocking agent, and on some occasions morphine, were associated with Saldivar's admissions regarding his actions. Like pancuronium, succinylcholine has legitimate clinical applications, particularly during emergency airway management. Morphine remains one of the most commonly used medications for severe pain control and, in appropriate circumstances, to ease respiratory distress in terminally ill patients. None of these medications are inherently sinister. Every day they are administered safely by trained healthcare professionals across the world. The danger lies entirely in unauthorized use, incorrect dosing, or administration without medical necessity. According to prosecutors, that distinction defined the criminal conduct in this case. One of the reasons investigators believed the alleged murders remained concealed for so long was that the physiological effects of these medications closely resembled the natural decline already expected among critically ill patients. Someone suffering from advanced respiratory failure who suddenly stops breathing does not necessarily raise immediate suspicion. Cardiac arrest frequently follows respiratory collapse in intensive care settings. Elderly patients with multiple organ failure may deteriorate rapidly despite aggressive treatment. In many respects, the deaths investigators later attributed to Saldivar appeared clinically consistent with illnesses the victims already possessed. This overlap between natural disease progression and the effects of paralytic drugs created one of the greatest challenges for law enforcement. Looking back, after the investigation concluded, it may seem surprising that unauthorized drug administration could occur within a hospital. However, the evidence presented during the case reflected a healthcare system operating under practices common for that period. Medication control procedures during the late 1980s and early 1990s were generally less technologically advanced than those found in many hospitals today. Electronic medication tracking systems were far less widespread. Automated dispensing cabinets with sophisticated access records had not yet become universal. According to the available information, investigators concluded that Saldivar was able to obtain medications such as Pavulon from hospital supplies or medication carts without immediately attracting attention. The disappearance of relatively small quantities of medication could easily go unnoticed within a busy institution caring for hundreds of patients. Equally significant was Saldivar's professional role itself. Respiratory therapists routinely moved throughout multiple departments, responding wherever patients experienced breathing difficulties. Unlike healthcare workers assigned exclusively to one ward, respiratory therapists often entered rooms across the hospital as clinical needs arose. Their presence rarely seemed unusual because respiratory emergencies occur unpredictably. Families expected them to appear quickly whenever alarms sounded or physicians requested assistance. This mobility allowed Saldivar access to numerous vulnerable patients without creating obvious patterns visible to any single department. During the criminal investigation, authorities also examined Saldivar's own explanations for his actions. His statements changed over time, presenting different motivations rather than one consistent account. Initially, he claimed that he had been attempting to relieve suffering. According to his early explanation, the patients were already dying, and he believed he was ending their pain. This justification immediately raised ethical and legal questions extending far beyond his individual case. Modern medicine recognizes carefully regulated forms of end-of-life care designed to relieve pain while respecting patient autonomy, physician oversight, and legal requirements. None of those safeguards existed in the actions prosecutors described. Investigators found no evidence that the patients had requested assistance in dying. There was no indication that families had consented to ending life. Hospital physicians had not authorized the administration of paralytic drugs for that purpose. Consequently, prosecutors rejected any characterization of the deaths as acts of euthanasia. As questioning continued, Saldivar offered different explanations. He acknowledged feeling overwhelmed by the demands of his work. He described hospital pressures, difficult patients, and exhausting shifts. At various points, he suggested that patients sometimes became burdens and that their deaths made his workload easier to manage. He also reportedly admitted that on some occasions he acted simply because dealing with certain patients had become inconvenient. These shifting explanations complicated efforts to understand his true motivation. They also weakened the credibility of his initial claim that compassion alone had driven his actions. Investigators ultimately concluded that regardless of the reasons Saldivar later offered, the evidence did not support the notion of mercy killing. The patients remained entitled to medical care rather than unauthorized life-ending interventions carried out without consent. Throughout the investigation, authorities remained careful to distinguish between documented facts and unsupported assumptions. They could establish that Saldivar had access to vulnerable patients, they could demonstrate his professional responsibilities placed him in close proximity to respiratory emergencies. They would eventually recover forensic evidence linking unauthorized Pavulon administration to 6 confirmed victims. What investigators could not conclusively establish was the precise reasoning behind every alleged act. Human motivation often resists simple explanation, particularly when the individual involved provides conflicting accounts. As a result, prosecutors focused less on psychological speculation and more on the objective evidence demonstrating unauthorized drug administration and unlawful deaths. By the time investigators fully understood the alleged method, another realization had become impossible to ignore. If Saldivar's own admissions about dozens of additional victims contained even a measure of truth, then identifying every potential homicide would require examining years of hospital records, countless patient deaths, and medical decisions spanning nearly a decade. What had initially appeared to be isolated suspicion surrounding a single healthcare worker was rapidly evolving into one of the largest and most technically demanding hospital homicide investigations ever undertaken, where science, medicine, and criminal law would soon collide in an unprecedented search for answers. For years, the concerns surrounding Efren Saldivar existed largely as whispers inside hospital corridors. Individual nurses remembered patients who had died unexpectedly soon after he entered a room. Some coworkers privately exchanged uneasy observations during shift changes, while others dismissed the pattern as coincidence in an intensive care unit where death was an unavoidable part of daily life. The rumors were unsettling, but rumors alone could not support criminal accusations. Every patient in question had arrived at Glendale Adventist Medical Center already suffering from severe illness. Physicians could explain each death through documented medical conditions, and no physical evidence suggested that anyone had intentionally intervened. In a profession built upon evidence rather than suspicion, uncertainty was not enough. Yet by 1997, the quiet doubts that had circulated for years were becoming increasingly difficult for some members of the staff to ignore. According to later accounts, hospital employees had begun noticing what they believed was an unusual concentration of deaths occurring during Saldivar's shifts or shortly after he became involved in respiratory care. The observations remained anecdotal rather than scientific. No one had conducted a statistical review. No toxicology reports indicated poisoning. No witness claimed to have seen him administer an unauthorized injection. Nevertheless, enough concern had accumulated that hospital personnel reportedly discussed the matter among themselves with growing seriousness. The unofficial nickname, Angel of Death, once little more than dark humor shared between exhausted healthcare workers, began reflecting a deeper sense of unease. Even so, suspicion without evidence presented a profound dilemma. Hospitals cannot simply remove licensed professionals from patient care because coworkers feel uncomfortable. Healthcare institutions must balance patient safety with fairness toward employees. Every accusation requires objective support. Without documentation proving wrongdoing, administrators risk making decisions based upon coincidence rather than fact. Intensive care medicine further complicated the issue because mortality rates were naturally high. Many patients treated in respiratory units were elderly, terminally ill, or suffering from multiple organ failure. Their deaths, although tragic, rarely appeared medically impossible. Every loss could be explained within the context of existing disease. As a result, any internal concerns remained exactly that, concerns. They had not yet become evidence capable of supporting a criminal investigation. According to the available record, Glendale Adventist Medical Center conducted an internal review after concerns were raised. The purpose of such a review was straightforward: determine whether any identifiable pattern or procedural irregularity justified further action. Hospital administrators examined the available information, but they did not uncover sufficient evidence demonstrating that patients had been intentionally harmed. Medical charts reflected serious underlying illnesses. Death certificates remained consistent with physicians' clinical assessments. Without forensic proof or eyewitness testimony, the review failed to establish criminal conduct. From the perspective of hospital management at the time, the investigation reached a frustrating conclusion. Something about the situation made several employees uncomfortable. Yet nothing available could transform those suspicions into demonstrable facts. Had events ended there, the allegations might never have extended beyond private conversations among hospital staff. Instead, a single anonymous phone call fundamentally altered the course of the case. In early 1998, the hospital received information from an unidentified caller alleging that Efren Saldivar had been helping patients die more quickly. The precise identity of the caller has never become one of the defining aspects of the public record. What mattered was the content of the allegation. Unlike informal rumors exchanged among co-workers, this communication directly accused a specific healthcare worker of intentionally hastening patient deaths. Hospital administrators recognized the seriousness of the claim. Rather than attempting to resolve the matter solely through internal procedures, they referred the information to the Glendale Police Department. That decision marked the moment when long-standing suspicions moved beyond hospital walls and entered the criminal justice system. Detectives faced an extraordinarily difficult assignment from the very beginning. They were not investigating a single suspicious death with an identifiable crime scene. Instead, they confronted allegations involving potentially numerous victims whose deaths had occurred over many years inside a functioning medical institution. Every alleged victim had already been seriously ill. Many had been buried or cremated. Medical records documented legitimate illnesses capable of causing death without criminal intervention. Before investigators could even consider filing charges, they first needed to determine whether any crime had occurred at all. Police began interviewing hospital personnel, gathering background information, and attempting to understand the role Saldivar occupied within the respiratory therapy department. They learned that he worked primarily night shifts and regularly cared for critically ill patients. They also became aware of the rumors that had circulated among portions of the hospital staff. While these conversations helped establish why concerns had eventually reached law enforcement, they still did not constitute evidence of homicide. Detectives understood that speculation, regardless of how widespread, could never replace objective proof. At this stage, investigators possessed questions but few answers. On March 11, 1998, the investigation took an astonishing and entirely unexpected turn. Efren Saldivar voluntarily agreed to speak with Glendale police investigators. What initially appeared likely to be a routine interview rapidly evolved into one of the most remarkable confession sessions in the history of hospital homicide investigations. During questioning, Saldivar made statements that stunned experienced detectives. According to investigative records, he admitted that he had personally killed approximately 40 to 50 patients during his years at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Even more startling, he suggested that the true number of deaths to which he may have contributed could range from 100 to 200. At one point, he reportedly stated that he had simply lost count. Such admissions, if true, would place the case among the largest series of healthcare-related homicides ever investigated in the United States. Yet despite the extraordinary nature of the confession, detectives immediately recognized a significant problem. Confessions alone do not automatically establish criminal guilt. The American legal system requires corroboration, particularly in cases involving multiple homicides. Investigators still lacked physical evidence connecting Saldivar to specific deaths. They had no toxicology reports identifying unauthorized medications. They had no recovered syringes. They had no eyewitnesses observing criminal acts. Every alleged victim had suffered severe medical illness before death. Consequently, even after hearing what appeared to be a sweeping confession, detectives understood that proving homicide beyond a reasonable doubt would require much more than Saldivar's own words. The situation became even more complicated when Saldivar later withdrew his confession. After obtaining legal representation, he asserted that the admissions should not be accepted as reliable. He maintained that he had spoken under psychological pressure and effectively retracted the extraordinary claims made during police questioning. With the confession no longer standing uncontested and still unsupported by physical evidence, prosecutors faced a difficult legal reality. However suspicious the allegations appeared, they could not build a successful homicide prosecution upon an uncorroborated statement that the defendant himself now denied. As a result, Saldivar was not immediately charged with the dozens of deaths he had described. In fact, because investigators still lacked sufficient evidence connecting him to specific murders, he was released. To outside observers, this development seemed almost unimaginable. A man had allegedly confessed to killing dozens of hospital patients, yet he walked out of the police station without facing immediate murder convictions. The explanation lies not in investigative failure, but in the fundamental principles of criminal law. Confessions must be tested against objective evidence. History contains numerous examples of false confessions arising from psychological stress, mental illness, coercive circumstances, or other factors. Courts therefore require prosecutors to demonstrate that a crime actually occurred and that the defendant committed it. Detectives understood that if Saldivar truly had murdered patients, the evidence had to exist somewhere beyond his own statements. The challenge was discovering where. That realization transformed the investigation from an interview-based inquiry into one of the most complex forensic examinations ever undertaken within a hospital setting. Rather than focusing exclusively on Saldivar himself, investigators shifted their attention toward years of patient records, medication histories, death certificates, and burial information. They needed to identify individuals whose deaths appeared sufficiently unusual to justify renewed examination. Every medical chart became a potential source of clues. Every documented death during Saldivar's shifts demanded closer review. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically. Detectives soon realized they were not dealing with a handful of suspicious cases, but with approximately 1,050 patient deaths that had occurred while Saldivar worked at the hospital over the years. Each file represented a separate human life, a grieving family, and a complex medical history. Distinguishing natural death from possible homicide within such an enormous collection of cases would require patience, scientific innovation, and an unprecedented level of forensic analysis. The confession had provided investigators with a direction, but not with proof. If they hoped to uncover the truth, they would have to rely not on words spoken in an interrogation room, but on evidence hidden within medical records, buried beneath cemetery soil, and preserved inside the remains of patients whose deaths had long been accepted as natural. Only science, they believed, could determine whether the hospital's darkest rumors reflected coincidence, or one of the most disturbing betrayals of trust in modern healthcare history. When Efren Saldivar walked out of the police station after withdrawing his confession, investigators understood that the most difficult stage of the case was only beginning. The interview had provided extraordinary allegations, but allegations alone could not sustain murder charges in court. If prosecutors hoped to prove that patients had been intentionally killed inside Glendale Adventist Medical Center, they would need evidence that could withstand the highest level of legal scrutiny. The challenge was unlike that faced in most homicide investigations. There was no traditional crime scene to examine. No murder weapon had been recovered. Years had passed since many of the suspected deaths. The patients had already been buried or cremated, and nearly every death certificate listed medical conditions that reasonably explained why those individuals had died. Detectives were no longer searching for a single overlooked clue. They were attempting to determine whether years of seemingly natural hospital deaths concealed a pattern of murder that had escaped detection. The first step required investigators to understand the full scope of the problem. Rather than concentrating only on the patients Saldivar had mentioned during questioning, authorities decided to conduct a comprehensive review of deaths that occurred during the years of his employment. Approximately 50 patient deaths associated with the periods in which Saldivar had worked became the starting point of the investigation. This enormous number immediately illustrated why the case demanded a methodical approach. Every medical file contained detailed information regarding diagnoses, treatment plans, medications, physician notes, nursing observations, laboratory findings, and the documented circumstances surrounding each patient's death. Yet reading medical records alone could not reveal whether an unauthorized injection had occurred. Most of the patients were already suffering from illnesses severe enough to be fatal. Their clinical histories reflected conditions such as respiratory failure, heart disease, advanced cancer, or multiple organ failure. Nothing in the paperwork automatically distinguished natural death from homicide. Investigators, therefore, began searching for common characteristics that might justify closer examination. They looked for patients whose deterioration appeared unusually rapid, whose deaths occurred shortly after contact with Saldivar, or whose medical records contained details that deserved additional scrutiny. Even with those criteria, however, narrowing more than 1,000 deaths into a manageable investigative list remained extraordinarily difficult. Eventually, authorities identified 20 patients whose remains could potentially provide forensic evidence. This decision immediately exposed another obstacle that detectives could not overcome through traditional investigative methods. Many of the individuals who had died during the relevant years had already been cremated. Once cremation has taken place, the possibility of recovering biological evidence capable of supporting toxicological analysis is effectively eliminated. Other patients had been buried long enough that investigators questioned whether any useful chemical evidence could still exist within their remains. Time had become one of the greatest adversaries in the investigation. Every month that passed after a burial reduced the likelihood that conventional forensic testing would detect medications administered before death. Nevertheless, investigators concluded that the 20 selected cases represented their best opportunity to determine whether Saldivar's confession reflected reality or fabrication. Exhuming human remains is among the most serious actions undertaken during a criminal investigation. It requires judicial authorization, careful coordination with cemetery officials, forensic specialists, and profound sensitivity toward surviving family members. Each grave represented someone whose loved ones had already endured loss and believed the circumstances surrounding the death had long been resolved. Reopening those graves meant reopening painful questions that many families never expected to confront again. Yet, without exhumation, detectives believed they would never obtain the evidence necessary to determine whether crimes had occurred. Once the remains were recovered, investigators confronted what many experts considered the central scientific challenge of the entire case. The medication prosecutors believed Saldivar had used most frequently was pancuronium bromide, commonly known as pavulon. Unlike certain poisons that remain detectable for extended periods, pavulon rapidly breaks down after death. Traditional toxicological methods available at the time were generally ineffective at identifying the drug months after burial. In many respects, the investigation appeared to have reached another dead end. Even if Saldivar had administered pavulon exactly as described during questioning, conventional laboratory testing might fail to detect any trace of the medication. Without scientific confirmation, prosecutors would again find themselves relying primarily upon an unreliable confession. Rather than abandoning the investigation, authorities sought assistance from one of the nation's leading scientific institutions. Specialists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory became involved in developing a method capable of detecting evidence that existing forensic techniques could not reliably identify. Their work represented one of the most significant scientific developments associated with the case. Instead of relying exclusively upon standard toxicological procedures, researchers developed analytical methods designed to search for evidence of pavulon within human tissues long after burial. The process required careful examination of preserved biological material capable of retaining chemical signatures despite the passage of time. Although the specific technical procedures involved highly specialized forensic science, the objective remained straightforward: determine whether patients who had never been prescribed Pavulon nevertheless carried evidence that the drug had been administered before death. The results fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Among the exhumed remains, forensic analysis identified 6 individuals whose tissues contained Pavulon at levels consistent with lethal administration. Equally important, investigators compared these scientific findings against each patient's medical records. Hospital documentation demonstrated that none of these 6 patients had been prescribed Pavulon as part of their treatment. In other words, the drug detected within their remains had no legitimate medical explanation supported by physician orders. This combination of forensic chemistry and documentary evidence provided investigators with something they had lacked from the beginning of the case: objective proof that unauthorized administration of a paralytic drug had occurred. For prosecutors, the significance of these findings cannot be overstated. Saldivar's withdrawn confession had raised the possibility of murder, but confessions can be challenged. Rumors among hospital employees suggested suspicious patterns, but rumors cannot establish guilt. The forensic evidence, however, existed independently of memory, opinion, or speculation. The laboratory findings demonstrated that patients had received a powerful paralytic medication without medical authorization. When considered alongside Saldivar's documented access to those patients and his own earlier admissions, investigators finally possessed evidence capable of supporting criminal charges. The 6 victims identified through this process were Jose Alfaro, Salbia Satrian, Myrtle Brower, Balbino Castro, Luina Shidlowski, and Eleonora Schlegel. Their names transformed the investigation from a broad inquiry involving hundreds of possible victims into a prosecutable homicide case built upon individually supported evidence. Investigators remained aware that additional victims might exist, but criminal courts require proof beyond a reasonable doubt for each specific charge. These 6 cases met that standard because the scientific evidence directly supported the conclusion that unauthorized Pavulon had been administered despite the absence of any physician's order. Another important piece of evidence involved a patient who survived. Jean Coyle became a crucial figure in the prosecution because her experience illustrated that the investigation was not limited exclusively to deaths accepted as natural. According to the evidence presented, Coyle experienced an unexpected respiratory collapse after receiving care from Saldivar. Unlike the confirmed homicide victims, however, she was successfully resuscitated by other members of the medical staff. Her survival proved significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrated that an alleged attack did not always result in death if intervention occurred quickly enough. Second, because she survived, investigators could examine the circumstances surrounding the event without relying solely upon post-mortem forensic evidence. Her case ultimately formed the basis for the attempted murder charge that accompanied the homicide counts. As the investigation progressed, detectives also recognized the limitations of their own success. Out of approximately 1,050 deaths reviewed, only 20 bodies could be exhumed for examination, and only 6 ultimately produced forensic evidence sufficient for prosecution. This outcome did not necessarily establish that only 6 patients had been unlawfully killed. It established only that 6 cases could be scientifically proven. The distinction became one of the defining characteristics of the Saldivar investigation. His own statements had suggested far higher numbers, including claims of 40 to 50 direct victims and perhaps 100 to 200 deaths overall. Yet investigators understood that those figures remained impossible to verify. Many potential victims had been cremated, permanently eliminating opportunities for forensic analysis. Other remains had deteriorated beyond meaningful examination. In countless additional cases, natural disease processes made distinguishing homicide from legitimate medical decline extraordinarily difficult. Rather than speculate beyond the available evidence, prosecutors focused exclusively upon the 6 victims supported by objective scientific findings. By doing so, they built a case grounded not in sensational claims, but in verifiable facts capable of surviving judicial review. Years of suspicion had finally produced measurable evidence. What had once existed only as whispers exchanged in hospital hallways had now been confirmed through forensic science. The investigation that began with rumors, uncertainty, and a withdrawn confession had evolved into one of the most remarkable examples of scientific innovation in modern criminal justice. The laboratory discoveries not only transformed the prosecution of Efrain Saldivar, but also demonstrated how advances in forensic medicine could uncover crimes once believed impossible to prove. With the evidence finally assembled, investigators handed the case to prosecutors, and the focus shifted from discovering what had happened inside the hospital to presenting those findings before a court of law, where Saldivar would ultimately face judgment for the deaths that science had finally brought to light. By the time prosecutors completed their review of the evidence gathered during the investigation, the case against Efrain Saldivar had changed dramatically from the uncertain inquiry that began with rumors inside a hospital. What initially consisted of uneasy conversations among nurses, an anonymous telephone call, and a confession later withdrawn had evolved into a prosecution supported by forensic science, medical documentation, and years of investigative work. The discovery of unauthorized pavulon in the remains of 6 former patients, combined with hospital records confirming that none of those individuals had been prescribed the drug, provided prosecutors with the objective evidence they had needed from the beginning, rather than attempting to pursue every death that had fallen under suspicion during the investigation. The prosecution focused on the cases that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision reflected a fundamental principle of criminal law. Prosecutors are obligated not merely to suspect guilt, but to establish it through admissible evidence capable of convincing a court. The larger questions surrounding the total number of possible victims remained important, but they could not replace the necessity of proving individual criminal acts. As a result, the legal case centered on 6 confirmed homicide victims and 1 surviving patient whose case formed the basis of an attempted murder charge. The 6 victims identified by investigators were Jose Alfaro, Salbaya Satrian, Myrtle Brower, Balbino Castro, Luina Shidlowski, and Eleanor Schlegel. Each of their cases represented months of painstaking forensic analysis in comparison with hospital records. Investigators had not relied upon assumptions that these patients died because they were elderly or critically ill. Instead, they established that pavulon had been detected in their remains despite the absence of any physician's order authorizing its use. This distinction became one of the strongest elements of the prosecution's case. The scientific evidence did not simply suggest that death had occurred. It indicated that a powerful paralytic drug had entered the victims' bodies without legitimate medical justification. Alongside the homicide charges stood the case of Jean Coyle. Unlike the 6 deceased victims, Coyle survived after suffering an unexpected respiratory collapse and being resuscitated by other members of the medical staff. Her survival added another dimension to the prosecution. Instead of relying exclusively upon evidence recovered after death, investigators could also present a case in which an alleged victim lived long enough to receive emergency intervention. Her experience ultimately supported the charge of attempted murder, demonstrating that the investigation had uncovered not only completed homicides, but also an alleged attempt that failed because medical personnel acted quickly enough to save a life. Faced with the accumulated evidence, Saldivar eventually entered into a plea agreement. In 2002, rather than proceeding through a lengthy trial requiring prosecutors to present every piece of forensic testimony before a jury, he formally pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. A guilty plea carries significant legal consequences. By admitting criminal responsibility in court, a defendant removes the need for prosecutors to prove guilt through a contested trial. At the same time, plea agreements often reflect practical considerations shared by both sides. For prosecutors, they provide certainty that convictions will be obtained. For defendants, they may eliminate the uncertainty associated with a jury verdict and, in some cases, avoid the possibility of additional legal consequences that might result from continuing litigation. In Saldivar's case, the plea agreement also reflected another practical reality confronting the prosecution. Although investigators had reviewed approximately 1,050 patient deaths, and Saldivar's own earlier statements had suggested far larger numbers of victims, proving additional murders beyond the 6 supported by forensic evidence would have been extraordinarily difficult. Many suspected victims had already been cremated, making toxicological examination impossible. Other remains had deteriorated to the point where meaningful chemical analysis could no longer be performed. Even where suspicions persisted, prosecutors could not ethically pursue homicide charges without evidence capable of satisfying the demanding standard of proof required in criminal court. Consequently, authorities concentrated on the cases that science had confirmed rather than attempting to rely upon speculation or unsupported estimates. Following his guilty plea, the court imposed 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Consecutive life sentences differ from concurrent sentences because each punishment is served one after another rather than simultaneously. The court's decision reflected the fact that 6 separate murders had been legally established, with each victim recognized individually rather than merged into a single sentence. In addition to those 6 life terms, the attempted murder conviction concerning Jean Coyle further underscored the seriousness of the offenses. The sentence ensured that Saldivar would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life without eligibility for release through parole. With the formal sentencing complete, one chapter of the investigation came to an end. Yet in many respects, the legal proceedings resolved only part of the broader story. Courts exist to determine criminal responsibility according to evidence presented before them. They do not answer every historical question surrounding a case. In the years following Saldivar's conviction, public attention increasingly turned toward the difference between what had been legally proven and what might never be known with certainty. That distinction became one of the defining legacies of the case. On one side stood the legal record. 6 murders had been established through forensic evidence, documentary records, and Saldivar's guilty plea. 1 attempted murder had likewise resulted in conviction. These facts no longer depended upon speculation or interpretation. They formed the official judicial conclusion reached through the criminal justice system. On the other side remained Saldivar's earlier statements during police questioning. Before withdrawing his confession, he had claimed responsibility for approximately 40 to 50 murders and suggested that as many as 100 to 200 deaths might somehow have been connected to his actions. Those statements generated widespread public attention because, if true, they would place him among the most prolific healthcare serial killers in American history. Yet the legal system could not simply accept those numbers at face value. Once Saldivar retracted the confession, investigators still required independent evidence supporting each alleged homicide. In most of those suspected cases, such evidence simply no longer existed. The passage of time had erased many investigative opportunities. Cremation permanently destroyed biological material that might have been tested. Natural decomposition limited what could be recovered from some buried remains. Critically ill patients often experienced complex medical declines involving multiple simultaneous illnesses, making retrospective reconstruction of the exact cause of death exceptionally difficult even with complete medical records. As a result, prosecutors deliberately avoided presenting unsupported estimates as established fact. They recognized that justice depends upon evidence rather than probability, regardless of how disturbing the allegations may appear. This careful distinction also shaped public understanding of the case. News reports frequently referenced the possibility that the true number of victims exceeded 6. But responsible reporting consistently acknowledged that higher estimates remained unverified. Investigators themselves believed additional victims were possible. Yet possibility differs fundamentally from proof. The criminal justice system requires certainty sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Anything less risks substituting suspicion for evidence, an approach incompatible with the principles governing criminal prosecutions. Saldivar's case, therefore, came to symbolize two separate realities existing simultaneously. The first was the undeniable fact that 6 patients had been unlawfully killed through unauthorized administration of Pavulon, as established by forensic science and confirmed through guilty pleas. The second was the enduring uncertainty surrounding the remaining deaths that could never be conclusively resolved because the evidence necessary to answer those questions had disappeared long before investigators understood what they were searching for. In many homicide investigations, the courtroom represents the final destination where uncertainty gives way to legal resolution. In the Saldivar case, however, the courtroom accomplished something more limited but equally important. It established accountability for the crimes that could be proven while openly acknowledging the existence of questions that the legal system could not answer. The verdict did not claim certainty where certainty was impossible. Instead, it drew a careful line between demonstrated fact and unresolved suspicion. That distinction preserved the integrity of both the investigation and the judicial process. Although the court had now spoken, and Saldivar would spend the remainder of his life in prison, one final question continued to echo beyond the courtroom walls. How many families had unknowingly buried loved ones believing they had died natural deaths? Science had answered that question for 6 victims. For countless others whose names appeared in hospital records, cemetery registers, or cremation documents, the truth, if it still existed at all, had become permanently intertwined with the passage of time, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of healthcare-related homicide investigations. In the end, the Saldivar case leaves behind 2 truths that exist side by side, and neither one can fully erase the other. The first truth is legal and documented. 6 patients were proven to have died after unauthorized Pavulon was found in their remains, and 1 additional patient survived an attack that led to an attempted murder conviction. The second truth is quieter, more unsettling, and in some ways more haunting because it can never be completely resolved. There may have been more. That uncertainty has always defined the final chapter of the case. The 6 confirmed victims were Jose Alfaro, Salbaya Satrian, Myrtle Brower, Balbino Castro, Luina Shidlowski, and Eleonora Schlegel. Their names matter because they are the only ones supported by forensic proof strong enough to survive in court. But they also represent something larger than a set of legal counts. They represent the collapse of trust in a place where trust is supposed to be absolute. Each of those patients entered a hospital expecting treatment, monitoring, and protection. Each was already vulnerable, already ill, already dependent on the skill and integrity of the staff caring for them. The revelation that a respiratory therapist may have used that position to hasten death is what made the case so disturbing, not only to investigators but to the public that later learned what had happened. Saldivar's guilty plea in 2002 brought the legal process to a close, but it did not resolve the broader human questions surrounding the case. He admitted to 6 murders and 1 attempted murder, and the court sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. That sentence ensured that he would never again leave prison as a free man. Yet the sentence could not answer the question that still lingers over the case more than any other. How many people actually died because of him? During his interview with police, Saldivar reportedly claimed that he had directly killed around 40 to 50 patients and suggested that he may have contributed to 100 to 200 deaths. Those statements were shocking, but they were never fully corroborated. Once he withdrew the confession, investigators were left with what science could prove and what it could not. In many cases, the physical evidence no longer existed. Some bodies had been cremated. Others had decomposed too far for meaningful toxicology, even where family members and staff may have remembered unusual deaths. Memory alone could not establish murder in a courtroom. That is why the numbers remain divided into categories rather than certainty: 6 proven, around 50 confessed, perhaps 100 to 200 suggested, but never verified. The distinction matters because it reveals both the power and the limits of criminal investigation. Science can uncover hidden crimes, but it cannot resurrect evidence that time has already destroyed. The case also had a wider impact beyond Saldivar himself. It demonstrated how vulnerable hospital systems can be when one person has access to medications, patients, and moments of clinical fragility. It exposed the difficulty of detecting crimes that mimic natural death, especially when the victims are already severely ill. It also pushed forensic medicine forward, because the investigation depended on a new method for detecting pavulon in exhumed remains months after burial. That scientific development was not just important for this one case. It represented a broader advancement in the ability to investigate hospital-related deaths that once would have been impossible to prove. The case showed that even when a patient appears to have died from an existing illness, investigators may need to look deeper if patterns begin to emerge. It reminded hospitals that internal rumors, while not evidence on their own, should not be dismissed when they begin to cluster around the same staff member and the same unusual outcomes. And it showed that the absence of immediate suspicion does not mean the absence of crime. Still, the Saldivar case should not be reduced to a forensic milestone alone. At its heart, it is about people who are already near the end of their lives and were supposed to receive care, not death. It is about families who trusted that the final hours of a loved one's life were guided by medical judgment and compassion. It is about the deep moral injury caused when a healthcare worker is accused of turning treatment into a weapon. That betrayal is why the story remains so disturbing even after the legal proceedings ended. The hospital setting makes the crimes feel especially intimate. These were not random strangers attacked on a street or in a parking lot. They were patients in beds, surrounded by monitors, medication, and staff whose role was to preserve life whenever possible. The very environment that should have offered protection instead became the setting in which violence, if the allegations and convictions are taken together, was hidden in plain sight. The case also forces a sobering reflection on how death is understood in intensive care units. In such settings, death is common enough that it can feel medically ordinary. Respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, advanced cancer, and multiple organ failure are all familiar endpoints in hospital medicine. That familiarity is precisely what made the alleged crimes so difficult to identify at first. Saldivar's actions, as described by investigators, exploited the fact that the deaths he caused could easily resemble the deaths expected in a hospital treating very sick people. The overlap between illness and criminal harm is what made the investigation so complex and why the eventual forensic breakthrough mattered so much. Without it, the case might have remained a collection of rumors, unease, and unresolved suspicions. Instead, science gave form to what had previously been invisible. Even so, the final uncertainty continues to shape how the case is remembered. There may be families who never knew the full truth about their loved ones' deaths. There may be hospital records that will never be fully reinterpreted. There may be names in the archive of Glendale Adventist Medical Center that will forever remain ambiguous because the necessary evidence no longer exists. That uncertainty is not a failure of the investigation so much as a reminder of how much time can erase. It is also a reminder that the criminal justice system can only work with what survives. Saldivar's story endures because it sits at the intersection of medicine, trust, and hidden violence. It is the story of a man who trained to help patients breathe and was later accused and convicted of using that access to take lives. It is the story of a hospital that became suspicious only after a pattern became hard to ignore. It is the story of investigators who had to rely on an extraordinary combination of persistence and scientific innovation to uncover the truth. And it is the story of 6 victims whose deaths could finally be proven, even if the full scale of the damage may never be known. In that sense, the case remains unfinished in the minds of many people, not because the legal system failed, but because the truth may have been buried too deeply by time itself. What remains clear is enough to chill anyone who hears it. Inside a hospital built on healing, a trusted professional was found responsible for murder. What remains uncertain is how many others may have died before anyone realized that the quietest danger in the building was not disease alone, but the person who had been allowed to walk from room to room with access to the sickest patients in the hospital. What remains after a case like Efrain Saldivar's is not simply a set of convictions or a final sentence, but a long shadow cast over the place where the crimes happened and over the people who had trusted that place most completely. Glendale Adventist Medical Center did not become infamous because it was unusual in the way hospitals look from the outside. It was in every outward sense what a hospital is supposed to be: a place of care, a place where machines are used to sustain life, a place where patients arrive when they are most vulnerable and leave their fate in the hands of strangers with training, credentials, and access. That is why the Saldivar case continues to disturb people long after the legal process ended. It did not unfold in an abandoned building or a hidden room. It unfolded in the same kind of environment where families expect competence, vigilance, and compassion. The betrayal, once revealed, felt larger than one man because it struck at the core assumption that allows modern medical care to function at all: that the people who move through hospital corridors are there to help, not to harm. The confirmed facts of the case remain stark. Saldivar was convicted for 6 murders and 1 attempted murder, and he received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The 6 proven victims were Jose Alfaro, Salbia Satrian, Myrtle Brower, Balbino Castro, Luina Shidlowski, and Eleonora Schlegel. Jean Coyle survived an attack that became part of the prosecution's case. Those facts are fixed in the legal record. But the case's emotional weight does not come only from the convictions. It comes from the gap between what could be proven and what may have occurred but can never now be fully reconstructed. Saldivar's own confession suggested far more deaths than the court could verify. He spoke of 40 to 50 direct killings and even suggested that he may have contributed to 100 to 200 deaths. Those statements were never independently confirmed, and they cannot be treated as proven fact. Still, they shaped public understanding because they hinted at a scale of loss that exceeded even the 6 murders established in court. That uncertainty is one of the most difficult parts of the story. It leaves families, investigators, and the public with the uncomfortable knowledge that the legal truth may not contain the whole historical truth. Some deaths were proven with forensic science because investigators were able to exhume remains and detect pavulon in tissue from patients who had never been prescribed the drug. That was the decisive breakthrough. Without those scientific findings, the case might have remained trapped between rumor and denial. The fact that only 6 victims could be proven does not mean only 6 were harmed. It means only 6 could be shown to the standard required by law. There is a difference between those two things, and the Saldivar case sits precisely in that difference. Time had already done much of its damage before the investigation truly began. Bodies had been cremated. Others had been buried long enough that decomposition made later analysis far more difficult. The hospital's records could show who was treated, who died, and what illnesses were present, but they could not always reveal whether an outside act had accelerated the end. That is why the case matters beyond its specific facts. It shows how fragile truth can become when crimes are hidden inside ordinary medical death. A patient who is already critically ill can die in a way that appears medically unsurprising. A respiratory therapist entering the room can seem entirely routine. A sudden collapse can be written off as the natural course of disease. In a place where death is expected, criminal acts can hide behind expectation. The case also showed how much investigative patience matters. The authorities did not solve the case by finding a dramatic scene or a single eyewitness. They solved it by reviewing roughly 50 deaths, selecting the cases most likely to yield evidence, exhuming remains, and pushing forensic science to do work it had not previously been asked to do in this way. The Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory's role in detecting pavulon months after burial was not a footnote. It was the difference between suspicion and proof. In that sense, the legacy of the case extends into science as well as law. It demonstrated that even medications with rapid post-mortem breakdown could sometimes be detected if investigators were willing to pursue new methods. That development matters because hospital-related homicides can be especially hard to prove when the victim is already medically fragile. Saldivar's case therefore helped reveal a broader truth about healthcare crimes. They are not always hidden by complexity alone, but by the everyday logic of hospital life. Sickness masks violence. Treatment masks intent. Death, in the wrong hands, can be made to look inevitable. There is also a more human aftermath that no sentence can erase. Families of the confirmed victims had to learn that the deaths they had accepted as natural were, in at least some cases, something else entirely. For them, the case did not end with a guilty plea. It ended with a revised understanding of loss. A death that had once been filed away as tragic, but ordinary, became something far more painful. A death that may have been deliberately caused by someone assigned to provide care. That kind of revelation alters grief itself. It introduces anger into mourning, and it replaces acceptance with the burden of questions that can never be answered completely. Even for those whose loved ones were not among the 6 proven victims, the case created a lingering unease. If Saldivar could do this within one hospital system, then what else had gone unseen in other places, in other wards, by other people with similar access? The case forces healthcare institutions to confront the reality that trust must be backed by safeguards, access to medications, review of unusual mortality patterns, careful documentation, and internal accountability are not administrative details. They are barriers against the possibility of abuse. Saldivar's crimes showed what can happen when those barriers are too weak or too slow to respond. At the same time, the case should not be remembered only as a story of institutional failure. It is also a story of persistence. The nurses who noticed unusual patterns, the person who made the anonymous call, the detectives who refused to stop at a withdrawn confession, and the scientists who developed a method to find what others could not, all played a role in bringing part of the truth into the light. They did not recover every answer, but they recovered enough to make the crimes undeniable. That matters because without that work, even the 6 proven victims might have remained part of a vague rumor instead of a documented criminal case. In the end, the Saldivar case remains unsettling precisely because it is incomplete. We know enough to understand the brutality of what happened. We know enough to say that a trusted hospital worker used his position to end lives. We know enough to see how vulnerable patients were and how easily ordinary medical death can disguise criminal action. But we do not know enough to say with confidence how many lives were actually lost. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the narrative. It is the narrative. It is the part that stays with people because it cannot be closed by a verdict. The hospital no longer exists in the public imagination only as a place of healing. It also stands as a reminder that trust, once violated inside medicine, can echo long after the perpetrator is imprisoned. Saldivar will spend his life behind bars, but the unanswered questions surrounding his case remain outside the prison walls. They remain with the records, the families, the investigators, and the science that proved only part of what may have happened. And that may be the most haunting legacy of all, that 6 murders were proven. 1 attempted murder was established. And beyond that line of certainty lies a broader darkness that time has made nearly impossible to measure. The story of Efren Saldivar is ultimately a story about the fragile boundary between life and death, between medical care and medical harm, and between what can be proven and what may remain forever unknown. Years after the investigation ended and the courtroom proceedings concluded, the case continues to attract attention because it represents one of the most unsettling examples of a healthcare professional accused of violating the fundamental purpose of medicine. A hospital is built around the belief that every person inside it is working toward the same goal: protecting life, reducing suffering, and providing care when patients and families are at their most vulnerable. The accusations against Saldivar challenged that belief in the most disturbing way possible. The person who had access to patients during some of their most fragile moments was ultimately convicted of using that access to cause death. The legal conclusion of the case was clear, but the questions surrounding it remained complicated. The confirmed facts established in court were limited but powerful. 6 patients were proven to have been murdered through the unauthorized administration of Pavulon, and Jean Coyle survived an attack that resulted in an attempted murder conviction. Saldivar received 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Those convictions represented accountability for the victims whose deaths could be scientifically demonstrated. However, they also marked the boundary of what investigators could prove. Beyond those cases existed a much larger field of uncertainty. The investigation reviewed approximately 1,050 deaths connected to Saldivar's work at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Each death represented a person with a medical history, a family, and a final moment that had already been accepted as natural. Determining whether any of those deaths involved criminal action required evidence that often no longer existed. This limitation shaped the entire case. Unlike many homicide investigations where investigators arrive shortly after a crime occurs and collect fresh evidence, the Saldivar investigation began after years had passed. The suspected victims had already been buried or cremated. Medical records had become historical documents rather than immediate investigative tools. Witness memories had faded. The physical traces of possible crimes had disappeared. Investigators were forced to work backward, reconstructing events from incomplete information and searching for scientific proof hidden beneath years of uncertainty. The success of the investigation depended on their ability to separate suspicion from fact. This distinction is essential because cases involving medical professionals can easily become distorted by fear. Once the possibility of wrongdoing is discovered, every unexplained death may appear suspicious. But investigators cannot operate on suspicion alone. They must determine whether there is evidence connecting a specific person to a specific criminal act. In Saldivar's case, forensic evidence provided that connection in 6 cases. The discovery of Pavulon in the remains of patients who had never been prescribed the drug transformed the investigation. It demonstrated that something medically unexplained had occurred. It provided a direct link between an unauthorized medication and specific victims. It allowed prosecutors to move beyond the question of whether something unusual had happened and toward the question of who was responsible. That transition from suspicion to proof is what made the case legally successful. Yet the uncertainty surrounding additional victims remained one of the most discussed aspects of Saldivar's story. His own statements created the possibility of a much larger number of deaths. However, those statements could not be accepted without independent confirmation. A confession, especially one later withdrawn, must still be tested against evidence. Investigators could not transform an allegation into a conviction simply because it was disturbing, or because it seemed possible. This principle is one of the most important lessons of the case. Justice requires not only finding answers, but recognizing when answers cannot be proven. The difference between 6 confirmed victims and the larger numbers suggested by Saldivar's statements demonstrates that distinction clearly. The case also changed the way many people viewed healthcare-related homicide investigations. Before cases like Saldivar's, the concept of a medical worker secretly harming patients was difficult for many people to imagine. Healthcare professionals are traditionally viewed as protectors. They are trusted with private information, physical vulnerability, and access to powerful medications because society depends on that trust. When that trust is violated, the emotional impact extends far beyond the individual victims. It creates fear because it challenges an assumption people rarely question, that the person standing beside a hospital bed is there to help. Saldivar's case became part of a broader discussion about angel of death cases, in which healthcare workers use their professional position to harm those under their care. These cases are especially difficult because the perpetrator often operates within normal medical routines. There may be no obvious struggle, no visible injury, and no dramatic confrontation. The alleged crime can occur through an action that looks like ordinary medical care. A medication administered, a patient monitored, a treatment decision made. The appearance of professionalism can become part of what allows the crime to remain hidden. The investigation also highlighted the importance of listening when patterns appear. A single unusual death may have a reasonable explanation. A second may still be coincidence. But when healthcare workers begin noticing repeated concerns involving the same individual, those concerns deserve careful examination. The rumors surrounding Saldivar did not immediately prove criminal activity, but they eventually became part of the information that led investigators to look closer. The lesson is not that every suspicion represents a crime. The lesson is that unexplained patterns should not be ignored simply because they occur in environments where tragedy is already common. Hospitals must operate on trust, but trust must be supported by accountability. The medical profession depends on systems designed to prevent mistakes and detect misconduct. Medication controls, documentation requirements, oversight procedures, and review of unusual outcomes all exist because human beings, despite their training, are capable of failure or wrongdoing. The Saldivar case demonstrated why these safeguards matter. It showed that even highly regulated environments can be vulnerable when one individual gains access to vulnerable people and uses that access improperly. Beyond systems and procedures, however, the case remains fundamentally about victims. It is easy for discussions of serial killers to become focused on the offender, their background, their motives, their actions, and their psychology. But the most important part of any true crime story is the people who suffered. The victims in this case were not numbers in an investigation file. They were individuals whose final moments should have been defined by care and dignity. Their families deserved answers, and in the cases proven in court, those families received confirmation that their loved ones had not simply experienced natural medical decline. They had been victims of deliberate actions. That truth cannot undo their loss, but recognition matters. It restores the reality of what happened and ensures that their deaths are remembered as crimes, rather than forgotten as ordinary medical tragedies. Looking back at the entire investigation, the Saldivar case represents both the achievements and limitations of modern justice. Investigators succeeded in uncovering hidden crimes that initially appeared impossible to prove. Scientists developed methods capable of revealing evidence years after death. Prosecutors secured convictions based on facts rather than speculation. At the same time, the investigation could not answer every question. Some possible victims will never be identified. Some families may never know whether their loved ones were among those harmed. Some records will remain forever open to interpretation because the evidence required for certainty no longer exists. That mixture of resolution and uncertainty is what defines the legacy of Efren Saldivar. The case ended with a conviction, but it did not end with complete knowledge. It gave society accountability, but not every answer. It revealed the truth about 6 victims while leaving unanswered questions about many others. And perhaps that is why the story continues to be remembered. It is not only a story about a criminal act. It is a reminder of how important trust is, how vulnerable people can become when they depend entirely on others, and how difficult it can be to uncover the truth when wrongdoing hides behind the appearance of ordinary care. In the end, The most lasting lesson from the Saldivar case is not simply that a healthcare worker committed terrible crimes. It is that vigilance, evidence, and compassion for victims must remain at the center of any effort to understand what happened when that trust was broken. The final chapter of the Efren Saldivar case is not defined by a dramatic courtroom confrontation or a final revelation that answered every remaining question. Instead, it ends with something far more complicated, a conviction that brought accountability, a scientific achievement that exposed hidden crimes, and a lingering uncertainty that continues to surround the possibility of additional victims. In many criminal cases, the conclusion arrives when a verdict is delivered and a sentence is imposed. The investigation closes, the offender is imprisoned, and society moves forward. But the Saldivar case remains different because the legal ending and the historical ending are not the same. The court established what could be proven. It did not and could not determine everything that may have happened. That distinction is the reason this case continues to be remembered as one of the most disturbing healthcare-related homicide investigations in American history. Efren Saldivar's conviction answered one essential question. Was he responsible for intentionally harming patients? The evidence presented through the investigation and confirmed through his guilty plea established that he was responsible for 6 murders and 1 attempted murder. The victims whose cases reached the courtroom were no longer unidentified tragedies explained only by illness. They became recognized victims of deliberate criminal acts. Their deaths were investigated, named, and acknowledged. For their families, that recognition was important. It changed the meaning of what had happened. A death that had once appeared to be the result of severe medical conditions was revealed. In those confirmed cases, to have been caused by someone who had entered the hospital as a caregiver. Yet even after justice was delivered, the central uncertainty remained. How many others may have suffered the same fate? This question has no confirmed answer. Investigators knew that Saldivar's own statements suggested a much larger number of victims. He claimed that he had killed approximately 40 to 50 patients and suggested that he may have contributed to 100 to 200 deaths. Those statements created a frightening possibility, but they never became established fact. The criminal justice system could not treat those numbers as proven because they were not supported by independent evidence. In the end, only the cases with scientific confirmation and sufficient legal evidence resulted in convictions. This separation between possibility and proof is one of the most important lessons of the case. In true crime discussions, there is often a temptation to focus on the largest possible number of victims because it creates a more shocking narrative. But responsible investigation requires restraint. The purpose of law enforcement is not to create the most frightening explanation. It is to determine what can be demonstrated through evidence. The Saldivar investigation followed that principle. It acknowledged the possibility of additional victims while refusing to claim certainty where certainty did not exist. The result was a case that was both successful and incomplete. The investigation proved that crimes had occurred, but it also revealed the limits of what time allows investigators to discover. The passage of years had permanently changed the evidence landscape. Many potential victims had been cremated, making scientific examination impossible. Others had been buried long enough that recovering chemical evidence became extremely difficult. Medical records could provide information about illnesses, treatments, and outcomes, but they could not always reveal whether a hidden act had altered the course of a patient's final moments. The investigation was therefore forced to confront a painful reality. Some truths disappear before anyone knows they need to be found. This reality is not unique to the Saldivar case, but the hospital environment made it especially significant. In most homicide investigations, death itself is the unusual event. In this case, death was expected. The patients under Saldivar's care were already seriously ill. Many were elderly or suffering from life-threatening conditions. Their deaths fit the patterns doctors and families had sadly seen before. That was precisely what made the alleged crimes so difficult to recognize. The environment provided an explanation for the outcome before anyone considered that an explanation might be wrong. This aspect of the case changed the way many people viewed patient safety and medical oversight. It demonstrated that the most dangerous situations are not always obvious. Sometimes the greatest challenge is recognizing harm when it appears identical to something ordinary. A sudden decline in a critically ill patient may be disease progression. A medication may be part of legitimate treatment. A healthcare worker entering a room may be performing a routine responsibility. But when those ordinary events become connected through a repeated pattern, they require careful attention. The Saldivar case also highlighted the importance of forensic science in modern justice. Without the development of methods capable of detecting pavulon in human remains months after burial, the investigation may never have moved beyond suspicion. The scientific work performed by specialists, including researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, became the foundation of the prosecution. It demonstrated that evidence can sometimes survive even when investigators believe it may be lost. It also showed that criminal investigations can depend on cooperation between detectives, medical professionals, and scientists. No single person solved the case. It required the combination of observation, persistence, and technology. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case is not about the offender at all. It is about remembering the victims. In discussions of serial crimes, attention often shifts toward the person who committed the acts. The offender's background, motivations, and behavior become the focus. But behind every criminal case are people whose lives were changed forever. The patients connected to Saldivar's crimes were not simply evidence in an investigation. They were individuals with families, memories, and relationships. They entered a hospital seeking care. They deserved dignity, honesty, and protection. The discovery that some of them had instead become victims of intentional harm represented a profound betrayal. Their families were forced to confront not only grief, but also the painful realization that the circumstances surrounding their loved one's death had been misunderstood. That emotional impact cannot be measured by legal documents alone. A sentence can punish the offender, but it cannot restore the time lost or erase the pain experienced by those left behind. What it can do is acknowledge the truth and ensure that victims are not forgotten. The story of Efrain Saldivar, therefore, remains a reminder of why accountability matters. The investigation did not uncover every possible answer, but it uncovered enough truth to prevent the confirmed crimes from disappearing into uncertainty. It showed that even cases hidden behind medical explanations can eventually be examined. It showed that rumors, when properly investigated, can lead to evidence. It showed that science can reveal what human memory and ordinary records cannot. But it also showed humility. Not every question can be answered. Not every suspected victim can be identified. Not every mystery can be solved completely. Accepting those limits is not a failure. It is part of respecting the truth. The final image of the Saldivar case is therefore not one of complete closure. It is an image of a line drawn between what is known and what remains unknown. On one side of that line are 6 confirmed victims, 1 surviving victim, a guilty plea, and a sentence that ensures Saldivar will remain in prison for life. On the other side are unanswered questions, lost evidence, and possibilities that cannot be proven. Between those two sides exists the lasting legacy of the case. Efrain Saldivar entered a hospital as a healthcare worker trusted with vulnerable lives. He left the public record as a convicted murderer whose actions damaged that trust in a way that continues to be remembered. The investigation that followed transformed suspicion into evidence and evidence into justice. Yet the unanswered questions remain as a reminder that some stories do not end when the courtroom closes. They continue through the memories of victims, the lessons learned by institutions, and the ongoing effort to ensure that those who depend on care are always protected. The tragedy of the Saldivar case is not only that lives were taken, it is that those lives were entrusted to someone whose responsibility was to protect them. The importance of remembering this case lies not in fascination with the crime itself, but in understanding the human cost, recognizing the warning signs, and preserving the names of those whose stories deserve to be remembered.